morning, children. This is Srikanth signing in for contracts 1. So, slowly we are moving to free consent. So, again, this is one of the major ingredient in constituting the contract. Again, we will go to essentials of a contract. Under section 10, what section 10 speaks about? All contracts or agreements, but all agreements are not contracts. To constitute a contract, certain conditions ought to be satisfied. We have analyzed 9 conditions, namely number 1, two parties, number 2, consensus ad idem, number 3, capacity to contract, number 4, free consent, number 5, lawful consideration, number 6, legal relationship, number 7, lawful object, number 8, terms must be certain, and 9, possibility of performance. Today we are going to analyze and discuss about free consent, right? So free consent is one of the essential elements of a contract. Whenever two persons are entering into a contract, they should give their consent without any outside influences. That means assume that A and B are there, both are entering into a contract. They should give their consent by exercising their free will. ரெண்டு பேரும் இண்டிபெண்டா ஆக்செப்ட் பண்ணணும் கான்ட்ராக்ட். ஸோ சப்போஸ் ஏ points out a gun to B and asks the B to enter into a contract, this contract is a void contract. Why? Here free consent is absent. So consent should be free. Let us analyze this consent under section 13. So, section 13 speaks about consent. The consent literally means agreed to or comply or expressing willingness or giving acceptance. Again I am reading. Consent literally means agreed to. Agreed to means both the parties are agreeing. Or comply. Comply means accepting or expressing willingness. Both are expressing their willingness to submit their legal obligations or giving acceptance. They are giving acceptance. Agreed to or comply or expressing willingness or giving acceptance. So this is the meaning of the term consent. If you go to section 13 of the Indian Contract Act 1872, it defines consent as two or more persons are said to consent when they agree upon the same thing in the same sense. Two or more persons are said to consent when they agree upon the same thing under the same sense. Same thing, same sense இருக்கணும். ஒரு கான்ட்ராக்ட்ல என்ன இருக்கணும்? சேம் திங் இருக்கணும், சேம் சென்ஸ். வாட் இஸ் திஸ் மீன்ஸ்? எஸ், இட் இஸ் நோன் ஆஸ் consensus ad idem. Same thing and same sense should emerge from both the minds of the offerer as well as the acceptor. So unless and until the parties are at ad idem, there is no contract. No consensus ad idem, no contract. That means both the parties must agree upon the same thing in the same sense. For a valid contract, offer and acceptance must correspond exactly to each other, right? So consensus ad idem இருக்கணும், அப்போதான் free consent அன்றது வரும். consensus ad idem లేకపోతే అది కాంట్రాక్ట్ కాదు. Two or more persons are said to consent when they agree upon the same thing in the same sense. That means they are giving the consent by exercising their free will On what? Upon the same thing in the same sense. Then they have given their consent, free consent. So again, consent is defined under section 13 of the Indian Contract Act. Now we are going to see what is meant by free consent. So, free consent. Consent is there, free consent is there. Remember, consent means you can give consent by exercising undue influence, extraneous considerations. But let us analyze the definition of free consent. Consent is said to be free when it is not caused by flaws in consent. Flaws means disqualification. If consent is obtained by flaws in consent, then it is not a free consent and the contract is voidable. Remember, voidable, it's not void. That means assume that A and B are there. A points out a gun to B and asks the B to enter into a contract, and B has entered the contract with A. Till B questions the same in the court of law, the contract is void. If B goes to the court and tells the court that A has taken my consent by pointing a gun to me, then court says it is not a free consent, contract is void. So consent is said to be free when it is not caused by flaws in consent, coercion, or undue influence, or fraud, or misrepresentation, or mistake. So, section 14 of the Act defines free consent as consent is said to be free when it is not caused by certain things. ஸோ கன்சென்ட் எப்போ ஃப்ரீ கன்சென்ட் ஆகும்னா இதெல்லாம் இருக்கக்கூடாదు, అదెல்லாம் இல்லை అన్నా అది ఫ్రీ కన్సెంట్. ఫ్రీ కన్సెంట్ ఎప్పుడు అవుతుంది అంటే కొన్ని ఉండకూడదు ఆ ఫ్రీ కన్సెంట్లో, అవన్నీ లేదు అన్నప్పుడు దాన్ని ఏమంటాము అంటే ఫ్రీ కన్సెంట్ అని చెప్పి చెప్తాము. లెట్ us see what are those things which should be absent in the free consent. So consent is said to be free when it is not caused by five things. Number 1, coercion as defined in section 15, undue influence as defined in section 16, fraud as defined in section 17, misrepresentation as defined in section 18, mistake under section 20, 21 and 22. So if these 5 things are absent, then consent is said to be free. What are those? Again, coercion, undue influence, fraud, misrepresentation, mistake. ఇవన్నీ కూడా ఉండకూడదు, இதெல்லாம் இருக்கக்கூடாது. இதெல்லாம் இருந்தாక அது కన్సెంట్ இருக்கும், ఫ్రీ కన్సెంట్ இருக்காது. కన్సెంట్ ఉంటుంది, ఫ్రీ కన్సెంట్ ఉండదు. సో when consent is said to be caused when it would not have been given but for the existence of such coercion, undue influence, fraud, misrepresentation, mistake. If a consent is obtained by coercion, undue influence, fraud, misrepresentation, mistake, then what happens? Contract is voidable. That means a person who is made to give such a consent can avoid the contract, but the person who obtained such consent by coercion, he cannot avoid the contract. Remember, here A cannot avoid the contract, but B can avoid the contract. So voidable contract is a contract which can be avoided at the option of one party only and not at the option of the other. So when there is no consent or no real and certain object of the consent, there can be no contract at all. When there is a consent but not free consent, there is generally a contract voidable at the option of the party whose consent was not free. So now you know that in a contract consent should be there. That consent should be free consent. So consent is said to be free when it is not caused by flaws in consent. Flaws means அது ஒரு disqualification contractல. So if a consent is obtained by any of the flaws in the consent, then what happens? Contract is voidable. For example, A is there, B is there. A point out a gun to B and ask the B to enter into the contract. Then who can avoid the contract? B can avoid the contract, but A cannot avoid the contract. That's what contract says. Indian Contract Act says if a consent is obtained by any one of the flaws in consent, it is not a free consent and the contract is voidable. So, what are those flaws? Coercion, undue influence, fraud, misrepresentation, and mistake. If a contract has been induced by these following elements, what happens? Remember, contract is not void, it is voidable. So, if a consent is obtained by coercion, undue influence, fraud, misrepresentation, mistake, etc., the contract is voidable. The person who made such consent, he can avoid the contract, but the person who obtained such consent by coercion, he cannot avoid the contract, right? So remaining things we will see in the next class. In fact, we will analyze what this coercion, undue influence, fraud, misrepresentation, mistake, we are going to see how it is influencing the contract. So, on the whole, in a contract, consent should be there. That consent should be free consent, free of coercion, undue influence, fraud, misrepresentation, mistake. Right, children? This is Srikanth signing off today. Have a good day, children.